Delia Washington had learned long ago that excellence was her armor. At 45, she'd spent 15 years as a senior FAA, a safety inspector, documenting violations that could ground entire fleets. Her work had saved lives, hundreds of them, probably though she never kept count. Numbers weren't what drove her. Justice was. On this particular Tuesday morning, she sat across from Regional Administrator Lisa Thompson in a sterile conference room at the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters in Washington, D.C. Between them lay a manila folder stamped Operation Clean Skies, Confidential, in bold red letters. "The complaints are getting worse," Lisa said, sliding another stack of documents across the polished table. Her expression carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many patterns go unchecked. "We're seeing discriminatory behavior across multiple airlines, but one carrier keeps appearing in our reports." Delia's pen moved steadily across her notepad, her handwriting precise and deliberate. She didn't look up when she spoke. "How many incidents are we talking about?" 23 formal complaints in the past 18 months, Lisa replied, all involving the same flight attendant, Karen Mitchell, 12-year veteran with the airline. Beside Delia, her husband Trevor leaned back in his chair, his pilot's instincts already analyzing the data like he would a pre-flight checklist. 20 years of flight operations experience had taught him to spot systemic failures before they became disasters. He tapped a highlighted section of the report. "Same pattern every time," he said quietly. "Passengers of color questioned about ticket validity, asked to provide credit cards as proof they belong in premium cabins, made to feel like criminals for sitting in seats they paid for." Delia's jaw tightened. She'd experienced enough workplace discrimination in her own career to recognize the coded language, the subtle ways people told you that you didn't belong. It never got easier to read about, even in clinical incident reports. "And the airline's response?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Lisa's expression darkened. "Standard corporate playbook. Apologize to complainants, offered travel vouchers, claim it was a misunderstanding. No actual disciplinary action. Karen Mitchell is still flying." Trevor studied the flight manifest on his tablet, his face unreadable. "So we go undercover. Document everything. See how deep this really goes." "Exactly," Lisa confirmed. "You'll be traveling as regular passengers on Flight 447 tomorrow morning. Premium tickets. Standard booking process. If there's systematic discrimination happening, we need federal documentation to force real change." She paused, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Remember, you're not there to entrap anyone. Just observe normal operations and document any safety protocol violations or civil rights issues you witness. Let them show you who they are." As they gathered their materials, Delia's phone buzzed with a text from her younger sister. "Grace, have a safe flight tomorrow. First class sounds fancy. Living your best life, Sis. Delia smiled faintly at the message, not bothering to correct her sister's assumptions. Grace didn't need to know that tomorrow's flight wasn't about luxury. It was about accountability. "Thanks. Love you." She texted back, then slipped the confidential files into her carry-on bag. Neither she nor Trevor could have predicted just how badly the next day would unfold, or how one flight attendant's prejudice would expose an entire system built on looking the other way. Part 2. The warning signs the same morning. At the airline's crew briefing room near the departure gates, Karen Mitchell was already setting the tone for her day. She stood at the coffee station, holding court with several other flight attendants like she owned the place. "I don't know what's happening with passenger screening lately," she complained to lead flight attendant Brad Stevens, her voice carrying across the small room. "We're getting more and more people trying to game the system sitting in seats they clearly can't afford." Brad shifted uncomfortably. He'd worked with Karen for 3 years and had grown increasingly concerned about her attitude towards certain passengers. There was always an edge to her comments, a pattern he couldn't quite ignore anymore. "Karen, we should probably focus on safety protocols rather than making assumptions about passengers' financial situations," he said carefully, keeping his tone neutral. Karen waved him off like he'd suggested something ridiculous. "Come on, Brad. You've been doing this long enough to know when something's off." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, as if she were sharing insider knowledge. "I can spot the fraudulent upgrades from across the cabin. It's about maintaining standards." Across the room, flight attendant Maria Rodriguez exchanged glances with another crew member. Maria had filed 2 separate reports about Karen's behavior with human resources, documenting incidents that made her deeply uncomfortable. Nothing had come of them. The company seemed more interested in avoiding complaints than addressing them. "Just remember," Brad said, his patience wearing thin, "our job is passenger safety and service. Nothing else." Karen grabbed her coffee and headed toward the door, her confidence unshaken. "Trust me, I know exactly how to handle problem passengers." Brad watched her go, a knot forming in his stomach. He'd been in aviation long enough to recognize when someone was a liability. Karen Mitchell was a ticking time bomb, and management's refusal to address her behavior was going to blow up eventually. He just didn't know it would be today. At the departure gate, Delia and Trevor sat quietly among the other travelers, blending in perfectly. To anyone watching, they looked like typical business passengers, well-dressed, professional, reviewing work on their tablets while waiting to board. Delia's screen displayed what appeared to be quarterly sales reports, but the documents were actually FAA compliance guidelines for crew anti-discrimination training. Trevor was reading what looked like industry magazines, but his focus was on recent safety violation reports from this exact airline. "Remember," Delia murmured softly, barely moving her lips, "we document everything, but we don't provoke anything. If there's discriminatory behavior, it needs to happen naturally, so our evidence holds up in federal court." Trevor nodded, his eyes tracking the crew as they prepared for boarding. Years of pilot training had taught him to observe human behavior for safety risks, body language, tone, patterns of interaction. What he was seeing in Karen Mitchell's interactions with gate agents was already concerning. She'd made disparaging comments about 3 different passenger groups in the last 10 minutes. She'd questioned the validity of an elderly man's upgrade, speaking to him like he was confused or lying. She'd openly rolled her eyes when a family with young children approached the premium boarding line. "She's already violating basic customer service protocols," Trevor noted quietly. "If this is how she behaves in public, I can only imagine what happens once we're on the aircraft." Delia felt the familiar weight of federal responsibility settle on her shoulders. They weren't just passengers today. They were the eyes and ears of aviation justice. They were the last line of defense for every traveler who'd been humiliated, dismissed, or discriminated against at 30,000 feet. The boarding announcement crackled through the gate speakers, and Delia took a deep breath. "Ready?" Trevor asked softly. She nodded, gathering her bag. "Let's see what kind of airline we're really dealing with." Neither of them could have predicted just how quickly things would spiral or how one woman's prejudice would change the aviation industry forever. Part 3. The Confrontation. The boarding process moved smoothly until Delia and Trevor reached the aircraft door. Karen Mitchell stood at the entrance like a gatekeeper, checking boarding passes with theatrical authority. Her smile was plastic, conditional warm for some passengers, cold for others. "Welcome aboard," she said cheerfully to the white businessman ahead of them. "Enjoy your flight in first class, Mr. Carter." The moment Delia approached, Karen's demeanor shifted like someone had flipped a switch. The smile vanished. Her eyes narrowed. She examined Delea's boarding pass like it might be counterfeit currency, holding it up to the light, flipping it over, studying the barcode with suspicious intensity. Karen muttered, loud enough for other passengers to hear. This is unusual. Delea kept her voice calm, though her pulse quickened. Is there a problem? Karen's expression hardened. Wow, these first-class seats weren't purchased at full price. You'll need to speak with the gate agent about proper seat assignments. Trevor stepped forward slightly, his protective instincts kicking in. Our tickets were purchased through standard corporate travel. Everything should be in order. Karen's eyes swept over Trevor, taking in his appearance, his confident posture, his expensive watch, his professional demeanor. If anything, his composure seemed to irritate her more. Sir, I'm going to need you both to step aside while I verify these tickets with my supervisor. Behind them, the boarding line began to back up. Passengers craned their necks to see what was causing the delay. Robert Carter, the businessman Karen had warmly welcomed moments earlier, pulled out his phone and started recording. Something about this felt wrong. Lead flight attendant Brad Stevens appeared from the galley, sensing trouble. Karen, what's the issue here? These passengers have questionable first-class tickets, Karen announced, her voice carrying throughout the boarding area like she was making a public service announcement. I think there's been a system error. Brad examined the boarding passes, his brow furrowing. They're clearly legitimate. Proper barcodes, correct flight information, valid seat assignments. He looked up at Karen, confused. These look fine to me. Let's get them seated so we can continue boarding. But Karen wasn't backing down. If anything, Brad's contradiction seemed to fuel her determination. Brad, I've been doing this for 12 years. I know when something doesn't add up. She turned back to Delea and Trevor, her voice growing louder and more aggressive. You need to show me the credit card used to purchase these tickets. The request hung in the air like a slap. Several passengers gasped audibly. Maria Rodriguez, seated in row 1D, looked horrified. This wasn't just inappropriate. It was humiliating. Delea's voice remained controlled, but there was steel underneath. Excuse me, are you requiring all first-class passengers to show their credit cards, or just us? Karen's face flushed red. She knew she'd crossed a line, but pride wouldn't let her retreat. Ma'am, when tickets appear suspicious, we have protocols. What exactly appears suspicious about our tickets? Trevor interrupted, his pilot training evident in his systematic approach to the question. Karen sputtered, searching for justification. Well, the booking code shows these were purchased through a corporate account. But you two obviously aren't executives. The words hung in the cabin like toxic gas. Even passengers still in the jetway could hear the confrontation now. Robert Carter's phone camera captured everything as Karen continued her tirade, digging herself deeper with every word. I see this all the time, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. People using company cards for personal travel, or getting charity upgrades they're not entitled to. These seats cost more than most people make in a month. Maria Rodriguez finally spoke up from her seat, unable to stay silent. This is completely inappropriate. Their tickets are clearly valid. Karen whirled around. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stay out of this. I'm trained to spot fraudulent passengers. Fraudulent? Delea repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. What exactly makes us fraudulent? But Karen was too deep in her power trip to recognize the warning signs. Look, I'm not trying to be difficult, but when people who clearly can't afford first class show up with premium tickets, red flags go up. It's my job to protect the airline from fraud. The cabin had become a pressure cooker. Every passenger was watching, recording, witnessing something that felt historic and deeply wrong. Trevor began reaching for his wallet, but Delea placed a gentle hand on his arm. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, a calculation Karen couldn't begin to understand. "We're not showing you our credit cards," Delia said firmly. "Our tickets are valid. We've committed no crime, and we're taking our seats." Karen's control snapped completely. "No, you are not taking those seats," she shouted, pointing aggressively toward economy class. "Security. I need security to escort these passengers to their proper section." Part 4. The removal Brad Stevens tried one more time to intervene, his voice urgent. "Karen, this has gone too far. That's just, Brad. Either you support your crew or you don't." Karen cut him off, her voice rising with self-righteous fury. "These people are trying to steal premium services they didn't pay for." Captain James Rodriguez emerged from the cockpit, drawn by the commotion. 25 years of flying had taught him to recognize when situations were spiraling out of control. His presence commanded immediate attention. "What's happening here?" he asked, his tone authoritative but measured. Karen's voice shifted, taking on a victim's tone. "Captain, we have passengers with questionable first-class tickets. They're being aggressive and refusing to cooperate with verification procedures." Captain Rodriguez looked at the boarding passes in Brad's hand, then at Delia and Trevor. His pilot instincts told him something was very wrong with this picture, but Karen was his crew member. He had to support his team. "Ma'am, sir," he addressed them carefully, "if you could just work with us to resolve this misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Trevor said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command situations. "We have valid tickets for these seats. Any verification can be done while we're seated." But Karen had already radioed for airport security. "I need officers at gate 23. We have passengers refusing to comply with crew instructions." Within minutes, 2 airport security officers boarded the aircraft. The cabin had become a circus of whispered conversations, recording phones, and growing tension. Security Chief David Kim reviewed the situation quickly, his expression neutral and professional. Karen presented her version with practiced urgency. "These passengers have questionable tickets and became belligerent when asked for verification. They're disrupting the flight and refusing to follow crew instructions." David examined the boarding passes carefully. They appeared completely legitimate, proper airline codes, valid barcodes, correct seat assignments. He glanced at Robert Carter, who was still recording, then at Maria Rodriguez, who was shaking her head in disgust. "Ma'am, sir," David addressed Delia and Trevor, his voice apologetic but firm. "For the safety of all passengers, we're going to need you to deplane while we sort this out." The words hit like a physical blow. Delia had flown for work countless times over 12 years. First-class trips, impeccable travel records, never a single incident. And now she was being removed from an aircraft because of the color of her skin. The walk down the aisle was the longest of their lives. Every passenger stared as they gathered their belongings and headed toward the exit. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked uncomfortable. A few looked away entirely. Maria Rodriguez called out, her voice breaking, "This is wrong. Completely wrong." Robert Carter continued recording as they passed. "I'm posting this everywhere," he said, loudly enough for Karen to hear. "Everyone needs to see this." As they reached the aircraft door, Karen delivered her final insult, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Next time, maybe book seats you can actually afford." Trevor's hand clenched into a fist, but Delia's touch kept him calm. She looked back at Karen with an expression that was impossible to read, not anger, not fear, but something else entirely. "You have no idea what you've just done," Delia said quietly. Karen laughed triumphantly. "Honey, I know exactly what I've done. I've protected this airline from fraud." As they walked up the jetway, Trevor pulled out his phone and began typing detailed notes about crew protocol violations. safety failures, and civil rights breaches. His pilot training made him methodical about documentation, timestamps, witness names, exact quotes. "How many federal violations did you count?" Delia asked quietly. "At least 6, Trevor replied, his fingers moving steadily across the screen. "Maybe more once we review the full sequence." Behind them, Karen was basking in her perceived victory, completely unaware that she'd just committed career suicide. She had no idea that the fraudulent passengers she just humiliated were federal aviation inspectors with the power to ground her airline. The investigation that was about to begin would expose not just Karen's behavior, but an entire system that enabled it. But first, they had to file their report with airport security, and that's when everything would change. Part 5. The truth revealed. The airport security office felt sterile and institutional, with fluorescent lights humming overhead and the distant sound of flight announcements echoing through thin walls. Security Chief David Kim sat across from Delia and Trevor, his expression showing he'd handled hundreds of these incidents, but never one that felt quite like this. "I need to get statements from all parties," David explained, opening a fresh incident report on his tablet. "Miss Mitchell, let's start with your account." Karen sat rigidly in her chair, her flight attendant uniform perfectly pressed, her story rehearsed and confident. "These passengers presented questionable first-class tickets and became increasingly agitated when I attempted to verify their validity. When I asked for additional identification, they became hostile and disruptive." She paused dramatically, as if the memory was traumatic. "They started arguing loudly, causing other passengers to become uncomfortable. The male passenger became particularly aggressive, raising his voice and making threatening gestures." David jotted down notes, then turned to Delia and Trevor. "Your version of events?" Delia spoke with the measured tone of someone accustomed to giving official testimony. "We boarded the aircraft with valid tickets for seats 1A and 1B. Miss Mitchell immediately questioned our right to sit in first class, demanded to see our credit cards, and made several statements suggesting we couldn't afford premium seating." Trevor added calmly, "At no point did we raise our voices or make threatening gestures. We simply requested to take our assigned seats." Karen scoffed audibly. "That's not what happened at all. They were clearly trying to take advantage of some kind of system error. What specifically made you believe their tickets were invalid?" David asked, his pen hovering over his notes. Karen's confidence wavered slightly. "Well, the booking codes looked unusual, and they just didn't seem like typical first-class passengers." "What does a typical first-class passenger look like?" David pressed. The question hung in the air like smoke. Karen realized she'd walked into dangerous territory, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "You know what I mean," she said defensively. "People who can afford those seats." David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, and his expression changed. "I need to step out for a moment." Airport manager Patricia Carter entered moments later, her professional demeanor barely masking her concern. She'd been with the airport for 15 years and knew that discrimination incidents could explode into federal lawsuits overnight. "I understand we have a passenger dispute?" Patricia asked, though her tone suggested she knew it was much more serious. Outside the office, David was reviewing security footage on his tablet with growing alarm. The video clearly showed the entire confrontation: Karen's aggressive posturing, her pointing gestures the moment she called security. More importantly, it captured audio of her most damaging statements. He returned to the office with a grim expression. "I've reviewed the security footage. Miss Mitchell, your account doesn't match what the cameras recorded." Karen's face paled. "What do you mean?" "The footage shows no aggressive behavior from these passengers. It does show you making statements about their ability to afford first-class seating and calling them fraudulent passengers." Patricia's phone buzzed continuously with emergency notifications. The passenger video had already been shared on social media dozens of times. Corporate communications was lighting up her phone. "Miss Mitchell," Patricia said carefully, "this incident is being reported on social media. We have multiple passenger witnesses, and they're all supporting Mr. and Mrs." She paused, realizing she didn't have their last names. "Washington," Delia supplied. "Delia and Trevor Washington." Something flickered in Patricia's expression. A hint of recognition, perhaps. Or just professional instinct sensing that this story had more layers. Karen became increasingly defensive as the evidence mounted against her. "I was doing my job. I was protecting the airline from fraud. If management supported their crew, instead of automatically siding with complaining passengers..." "Miss Mitchell," Patricia interrupted. "At this point, the airline is conducting its own investigation. You'll be suspended pending the outcome." "Suspended?" Karen's voice cracked. "For what?" "For doing my job?" "For discriminatory treatment of passengers," Patricia said bluntly. "For violating company policy regarding customer service. For creating a public relations nightmare." Meanwhile, Trevor had been quietly documenting every procedural failure he'd witnessed. His notebook was filled with observations about inadequate crew training, systemic failures in complaint handling, and violations of federal aviation safety protocols. Patricia turned to them with the airline's standard peace offering. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington, the airline would like to offer you full refunds, future travel vouchers, and an upgrade to our premium rewards program." Delia's response was measured and professional. "We appreciate the gesture, but this isn't about compensation." "Then, what would resolve this situation?" Patricia asked. Delia and Trevor exchanged a glance that carried years of shared experience fighting injustice. "Accountability," Delia said simply. "Real accountability." Patricia nodded, not understanding that she was about to discover what real accountability looked like. "When you discriminate against federal aviation inspectors." She pulled out her tablet. "I'll need to see identification from everyone involved. Standard procedure for any discrimination allegation." Karen shifted nervously. The word discrimination made her uncomfortable. It suggested she'd done something wrong beyond just maintaining standards. "This is ridiculous," Karen muttered. "I was protecting the airline's interests." Patricia ignored her, focusing on the passengers who'd remained remarkably calm throughout this entire ordeal. There was something about their composure that didn't fit the typical pattern of upset travelers. "Mr. and Mrs. Washington, if I could see your driver's licenses?" Delia reached into her carry-on bag, not for a wallet, but for a leather credential case. She opened it slowly, deliberately, and placed it on the table. The room fell silent. Patricia's eyes widened as she read the gold-embossed text: Federal Aviation Administration, Senior Safety Inspector. Below it, Delia's official photo and federal identification number. "Oh my God," Patricia whispered. Trevor quietly produced his own credentials. Federal Aviation Administration, Flight Operations Inspector. Karen's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. Security Chief David Kim leaned forward to examine the credentials, his expression grave. 20 years in airport security, and he'd never seen anything like this. "You're federal aviation inspectors," Patricia said, her voice barely audible. "Senior inspectors," Delia corrected gently. "We were conducting an unannounced compliance inspection of this airline's operations." The implications hit everyone. Simultaneously, this wasn't just a customer service failure or even a discrimination complaint. This was a federal civil rights violation committed against the very officials responsible for regulating the aviation industry. Karen finally found her voice, but it came out as a strangled whisper. You're FAA?" Trevor nodded grimly. 15 years with the agency from my wife. 20 for me. We specialize in cabin crew protocol compliance and safety culture assessments. The storm had just begun. Part 6. The investigation begins within 4 hours of the incident. Emergency conference calls ricocheted between corporate boardrooms, federal offices, and legal departments across 3 time zones. The viral video had been viewed over 2 million times, and major news networks were already reaching out for statements. At FAA regional headquarters, Administrator Lisa Thompson convened an emergency response team. The secure conference room filled with senior investigators, civil rights attorneys, and aviation safety specialists. "Ladies and gentlemen," Lisa began, a voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "we have a code red situation. 2 of our most senior inspectors were subjected to racial discrimination while conducting an official investigation. This is now a priority federal case." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, showing Delia and Trevor's credentials and service records. Inspector Delia Washington has been with the agency for 15 years. Her safety assessments have grounded dangerous aircraft and saved countless lives. Inspector Trevor Washington spent 12 years as a commercial pilot before joining FAA investigations. They are among our most respected professionals. The room watched security footage from the airport, then passenger video from inside the aircraft. The evidence was overwhelming and damning. Every word, every gesture, every moment of humiliation captured in crystal clarity. Deputy Administrator Michael Carter spoke up. "What's our legal exposure here?" Chief Counsel Sandra Martinez replied, "Substantial. We're looking at federal civil rights violations, aviation safety violations, and potential criminal charges. But more importantly, this exposes systematic discrimination that could affect every airline's operating license." Meanwhile, at the airline's headquarters, CEO Michael Harrison paced his corner office like a caged animal. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story broke board of directors. Major investors, insurance carriers, all demanding immediate answers. His chief legal officer, David Park, spread documents across the conference table. "Michael, this is worse than we initially thought. I've reviewed Karen Mitchell's personnel file. 23 discrimination complaints in 5 years, and we have documentation showing management was aware of the pattern." Harrison's face reddened. Why wasn't she terminated years ago? Because HR treated each incident as isolated customer service issues. They never connected the dots to see the discriminatory pattern. And honestly, middle management didn't want to deal with the paperwork. Head of Human Resources Janet Walsh entered with another stack of files. "I've interviewed 15 crew members about Karen's behavior. The statements are troubling." She read from her notes. Flight attendant Maria Rodriguez filed 2 formal complaints about Karen's inappropriate comments about passengers of color. Lead flight attendant Brad Stevens documented 3 incidents where Karen questioned black passengers' ticket validity without cause. Captain Williams reported that Karen frequently made jokes about passenger demographics. "And what action did we take?" Harrison asked, though he already knew the answer. "Customer service retraining. Verbal counseling. We moved her between different flight routes to avoid problem passengers." Janet's voice grew quieter. "We essentially enabled her behavior." Park pulled up social media monitoring on his laptop. "It gets worse. Former passengers are coming forward with their own Karen Mitchell stories. We're up to 37 documented incidents now, and the number's growing hourly." The trending hashtag, Karen the airplane, had sparked a flood of testimony from travelers who'd experienced similar treatment. Each story followed the same pattern: assumptions about economic status, demands for additional verification, humiliating public confrontations. At the federal building, Delia and Trevor were providing detailed testimony to a panel of investigators. Their account was methodical, professional, and devastating. Described Miss Mitchell's initial approach. Requested Special Agent Jennifer Kim from the FBI Civil Rights Division. Delia referred to her contemporaneous notes. At 8:47 a.m., she approached our seats and immediately stated there'd been a mistake with our seating, that these seats were for paying customers. Her tone and body language indicated she'd already concluded we didn't belong in first class. What specific actions did she take that violated federal aviation regulations? Asked FAA Inspector General Robert Martinez. Trevor opened his investigation tablet. She demanded financial documentation not required of other passengers in violation of Title 14. Code of Federal Regulations, Part 250, Section 9. She forcibly removed paying passengers without safety justification, violating Title 14, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 121, Section 580. The investigators were particularly interested in the airline's response after learning about the inspectors' identities. Did airline management express any concern about systemic discrimination issues? Agent Kim asked. Initially, their focus was entirely on damage control, Delia replied. Airport Manager Carter immediately offered standard compensation packages. There was no acknowledgement of civil rights violations until we identified ourselves as federal inspectors. Special Agent Kim made detailed notes. And what was Miss Mitchell's reaction upon learning your identities? Terror, Trevor said bluntly, followed by attempts to justify her actions and blame company policies. Back at the airline's Crisis Management Center, the situation continued deteriorating. Stock prices had dropped 12% in after-hours trading. Corporate sponsors were reconsidering partnerships. Employee morale was plummeting as crews worried about federal investigations of their own behavior. The reckoning had begun, and there was no turning back. Part 7. Justice arrived 6 months after that fateful morning flight. The Federal District Courthouse in Washington, D.C., buzzed with media attention and public interest. Today marked the culmination of the most significant civil rights case in aviation history. Judge Patricia Williams called the packed courtroom to order. Representatives from major airlines, civil rights organizations, and aviation industry groups filled every available seat. We are here today for the final hearing in the matter of Washington versus Skyline Airlines and Mitchell, Judge Williams announced. This case has revealed systematic discrimination that demands comprehensive judicial response. At the plaintiff's table, Delia and Trevor sat with Department of Justice attorneys who'd spent months building an airtight case. At the defense table, Skyline Airlines' legal team looked defeated, surrounded by boxes of damaging evidence they couldn't refute. Karen Mitchell was notably absent. She'd pleaded guilty to federal civil rights violations 3 weeks earlier, accepting a plea agreement that included permanent banishment from the aviation industry and 2 years of community service with civil rights organizations. Judge Williams reviewed the findings with methodical precision. The evidence shows defendant Mitchell committed deliberate, repeated acts of racial discrimination against passengers over a 5-year period. More disturbing, defendant Skyline Airlines had documented knowledge of this pattern and failed to take corrective action. She turned to the airline's representatives. CEO Harrison, your company received 47 formal discrimination complaints about Miss Mitchell. Your response was customer service training and route reassignments. You enabled discriminatory behavior through institutional negligence. Harrison stood, his voice strained. Your Honor, the airline accepts full responsibility for these failures. We have implemented comprehensive reforms, Mr. Harrison. Judge Williams interrupted. Your reforms were prompted by federal investigation, not corporate conscience. This court will ensure lasting change through judicial enforcement. The judge announced the penalties with devastating precision. Skyline Airlines will pay $2.3 million in federal civil rights fines, the largest such penalty in aviation history. An additional $850,000 will fund victim compensation for affected passengers. The courtroom stirred as the financial implications sank in. But Judge Williams wasn't finished. Furthermore, Skyline Airlines will operate under federal civil rights monitoring for 24 months. Quarterly FAA inspections will assess compliance with anti-discrimination protocols. Any future violations will result in immediate license suspension. She continued with operational requirements that would transform the airline industry. All crew members will complete 40 hours of federal civil rights training annually. Passenger complaint systems will be restructured with mandatory federal reporting of discrimination allegations. Corporate executives will face personal liability for enabling discriminatory practices. At the witness table, Delia rose to deliver her victim impact statement. Her voice carried the authority of someone who dedicated her career to aviation safety and civil rights. Your Honor, this case represents more than individual discrimination. It exposes systematic failures that compromise aviation safety. When crew members make decisions based on racial bias rather than professional protocols, they endanger everyone aboard the aircraft. She gestured toward the gallery where 78-year-old Margaret Williams and other victims sat with quiet dignity. These passengers deserve more than compensation. They deserve an aviation industry that values civil rights as much as operational profits. They deserve crews trained to serve all passengers with equal professionalism and respect. Judge Williams nodded approvingly. Inspector Washington, your testimony highlights the intersection between civil rights and public safety. This court recognizes that discrimination isn't just morally wrong, it's operationally dangerous. The judge's final announcement sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. This court orders the Federal Aviation Administration to establish new civil rights enforcement protocols for all commercial carriers. Discrimination complaints will trigger mandatory federal investigations. Airlines that fail to address systematic bias will face license revocation. As the gavel fell, the implications rippled beyond the courtroom. Within hours, 12 major airlines announced voluntary adoption of the court-mandated reforms. Industry executives recognized that proactive compliance was cheaper than federal enforcement. At Skyline Airlines headquarters, the transformation was already visible. Brad Stevens, promoted to Director of Diversity and Inclusion, oversaw comprehensive crew retraining programs. Captain Rodriguez, now Chief Safety Culture Officer, ensured that civil rights compliance was integrated into all operational procedures. The Victim Compensation Program distributed funds to 63 passengers who'd experienced discrimination. Margaret Williams used her settlement to establish a scholarship fund for young people pursuing careers in transportation equity. But perhaps the most significant change was cultural. Airport Security Chief David Kim reported a 340% increase in passengers reporting discriminatory treatment. People aren't accepting discrimination silently anymore, he explained. They know their rights and expect airlines to respect them. The case established legal precedent that extended far beyond aviation. Transportation companies across all industries were reviewing their civil rights compliance, recognizing that discrimination carried federal consequences. 6 months after being humiliated and removed from first class, Delia and Trevor had achieved something remarkable: systematic change enforced by federal law, protecting future travelers from the discrimination they'd experienced. Justice hadn't just been served. It had been institutionalized. Part 8. The New Sky. 1 year later, the transformation was undeniable. At Skyline Airlines Training Center in Atlanta, new flight attendants completed their final day of mandatory civil rights education. The 40-hour curriculum, developed under federal oversight Had become the industry gold standard. Instructor Brad Stevens addressed the graduating class with hard-earned wisdom. Your job isn't just passenger safety, it's passenger dignity. Every person who boards your aircraft deserves equal treatment, regardless of their appearance, accent, or assumptions you might make about their background. He clicked a slide showing passenger satisfaction scores. Our customer ratings have improved 34% since implementing these protocols. Turns out treating people with respect is good business. The ripple effects extended far beyond one airline. The Federal Aviation Administration reported that industry-wide discrimination complaints had dropped 67%, while passenger reporting of incidents had increased dramatically. The message was clear: discrimination still happened, but it was no longer tolerated or ignored. Margaret Williams, now 79, sat in first class on her quarterly flight to visit grandchildren in Seattle. The same route where Karen Mitchell once humiliated her was now staffed by crews trained in federal civil rights protocols. The flight attendant greeted her warmly, no questions asked, no assumptions made. It's amazing how different flying feels when you're treated like a human being, Margaret reflected, gazing out the window at clouds that once symbolized barriers but now represented freedom. At FAA headquarters, Delia and Trevor continued their inspection work with renewed purpose. Their case had given them tools they never had before. Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Authority that made airlines take discrimination seriously. We're still finding problems, Delia explained to a congressional oversight committee. But now airlines fix them instead of hiding them. The industry knows we're watching, and passengers know they have rights. Trevor added, the most important change is cultural. Crew members understand that discrimination isn't just wrong, it's career.